No arguing. Black bastards like you only cause trouble and act violently. Why are you even in this upscale residential park? Do you think you can roam here freely? Crowley snarled, then slammed his elbow into Brian's neck, forcing his face onto the cold stone ground, all under the indifferent gaze of a shameless white crowd. A black man humiliated in an upscale park just for jogging. But when the shining FBI badge appeared, the whole space fell silent. The officer's face went pale. The man forced to kneel was the director of the Federal Criminal Investigation Unit. Which state are you in? If you were treated like ass, would you stay silent or set the whole system on fire? Early in the morning, the Central Park was still covered with a thin mist. People walking dogs passed across the grass. Some groups practiced yoga to soft music from their phones. No one paid attention to the black man in a gray hoodie and dark sweatpants jogging along the gravel path. Brian Hayes maintained a steady pace. His earbuds were in place, but no music played. His phone was safely tucked in his jacket pocket, and he carried no FBI badges in every usual morning run. He didn't want people to see him differently, though he was used to being watched with subtle, discriminatory eyes. A white woman walked toward him. When she was less than 3 steps away, she suddenly veered sharply aside, turning her face away, gripping her dog's leash tightly. Brian did not react. He was too familiar with this silent, cautious reflex. After running a few more meters, a shout rang out behind him. "Stop!" Brian froze and turned. A white police officer approached quickly. His uniform was neat, name tag, Crowley. His hand rested on his belt near his gun. "You just ran through an area with a complaint about suspicious behavior. Hands up." His voice was full of suspicion, with no hesitation. Brian raised both hands calmly. "I'm doing nothing, just jogging. No arguing. Black guys like you only cause trouble with violent behavior. Why are you in this upscale residential park?" Crowley stepped forward, elbowing Brian down, forcing him face first onto the gravel. "I'm not carrying anything. No weapons," Brian said slowly, not resisting. Crowley pressed harder on his shoulder, knee on his back. Brian's breathing slowed. His face pressed close to the cold ground. He saw the shoes around him starting to stop. Some nearby people took out their phones, confused, whispering, but no one intervened. Not far, a white boy flying a kite with his father turned at the shout. He didn't understand what was happening, only saw a black man pinned to the ground in the park. He pulled out an old phone from his backpack and started recording. Crowley ignored his surroundings, his face flushed, eyes full of hatred. "Kneel properly, hands behind your neck," he yelled. Brian complied, eyes cold, not fearful. That calmness seemed to infuriate Crowley more. Then, without warning, Crowley kicked Brian hard in the shoulder. A brutal, decisive kick, all his strength behind it. "We're tired of you thinking you can do whatever you want," Crowley shouted. Brian kept his balance after the kick, didn't fall completely. He lifted his head, silent. But that gaze, looking straight at Crowell, made Crowell freeze for half a second. No one knew. The man kneeling there was no ordinary citizen. The crowd began to stir. A red-haired woman filming shouted, "He didn't do anything wrong. Everyone record this. Stop being silent." Others raised their cameras. Crowley turned back, face red, shouting, "Step back. This is duty enforcement. Obstructing an officer is illegal." He yelled, not for security, but to cover his growing unease. Brian did not react. He knelt as ordered, hands behind his head. From start to finish, no resistance. His eyes showed no fear or anger, only a cold depth, as if observing a wild creature screaming because it was caught. When Crowley bent to handcuff him, Brian said, firmly, "Do you know what you just did?" Crowley hesitated. Brian spoke clearly. "I cannot be a suspect. I am the director of the Criminal Investigations Division. FBI. The space froze. The crowd silent. The red-haired woman stammered. "He's FBI?" A man whispered, "Oh my God, we just saw an officer kick an FBI leader." Others gathered, cameras raised, eyes shifting from anger to shock. Crowley said nothing for seconds. Sweat dripped from his temples. Instead of stepping back, he gave a forced smile and sneered, "You say you're FBI? A black guy kneeling in the park wearing a shabby hoodie, no badge, no weapon, no witnesses. You think I'm scared of that? You think that name tag will make anyone believe you? He glanced at the crowd, then continued. An old black guy can only be a troublemaker or an imposter. No one answered. The air thickened. Brian stood without waiting, badge held firmly before Crowley. A final reminder. This is not over. His voice was cold, calm. Crowley stepped back. The crowd did not disperse. The boy's phone kept recording. Brian said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a small, oval-shaped metallic object, shining silver. It was an FBI badge, clearly engraved with his name, Brian A. Hayes, Director, Criminal Investigations Division. He raised it to Crawley's eye level, his grip firm, steady, without trembling or showmanship. The badge reflected the morning sunlight sparkling amid the circle of people holding up phones to record. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hush. Crowley stood frozen, eyes locked on the badge as if it had just burned down the last remnant of power he clung to. A young officer nearby stepped back half a step. The others held their positions, but their gazes began to change. No one was laughing anymore. No one was mocking. "You?" Crowley started, but his voice choked. I didn't know. I thought you were—" He stopped, searching for supportive eyes, but there were none. His former comrades avoided his gaze. The word Fiat Buy was no longer just a symbol from an action movie. It was reality, and it just shattered the due process facade he relied on to humiliate a man. Behind the trees, a red-hailed woman filming shouted, "Oh my God, it's real! He's really FBI!" Her words immediately sparked a wave of whispers in the crowd. "We just witnessed a crime where the victim is one of the highest-ranking officials in the justice system," a middle-aged man murmured, voice trembling. The boy filming steadied his hands. His eyes no longer showed fear, but something else. Profound astonishment and a faint feeling of justice emerging for the first time. Brian did not react. He said no more. He simply stood up, unhurried, without threat. He put the badge back into his pocket, adjusted his cuff. His eyes slowly scanned the crowd, not judging, not seeking approval, but as a warning. Some lowered their heads. Some quietly turned off their cameras. But no one looked away. All eyes were fixed on the man who had just shifted from being humiliated to a figure who left the entire system speechless. Crowley dared not say another word. He stood stunned, hands still in the position to cuff. The handcuffs now seemed redundant, ridiculous. Sweat poured down his temples. No one touched him, but he knew from this day on he had lost everything. Brian walked away. He said firmly, "We will meet in court," without looking back. No rush. He walked as if he had rehearsed this moment thousands of times in his mind. But this time was different. This time, someone witnessed it. And with every step Brian took was an irreversible determination to bring everything into the light, even if that light forced the entire system to shut its eyes. However, Crowley was not to be underestimated. After Brian left, he smirked, thinking to himself, "You think my system will let you go? Just wait. I will drag you down to ruin and disgrace. Lose your position." Less than 12 hours after the incident in the park, the first video was shared on social media with the title, "A Black Man Kicked by a White Officer in Broad Daylight." At first, it was just another video among the countless angry content users often scroll past. But only a few hours later, when it was confirmed that the man assaulted was the director of the FBI Criminal Investigations Unit, everything exploded. Major news outlets immediately reported it, headlines flooding the screen in red. FBI director kicked by white officer in the park. Clips capturing Crowley's gaze upon seeing the badge. Brian quietly pulling out evidence, every detail analyzed like a living indictment. Within a day, the video amassed over 3 million views. Major platforms simultaneously pushed the news to their front pages. Comments poured in heavily, sharply divided into two opposing camps. One side claimed it was undeniable proof of systemic racial discrimination. The other side hesitated, citing reasons of unclear procedure. But support for Brian spread rapidly. That night, people began protesting in multiple cities. Human rights organizations, previously silent, suddenly issued statements demanding the immediate suspension of Officer Crowley and a comprehensive investigation. Some politicians awkwardly appeared on television, declaring the need to review law enforcement behavior. Others avoided the press, refusing to comment. Within the first 24 hours, an online petition calling for Crowley's suspension gathered more than 100,000 signatures. Such a response had never happened for a case without a fatality. However, a group still defended Officer Crowley, arguing that many black people were truly bad and deserved such punishment. Social media was always a double-edged sword. Every word was like a sharp dagger aimed at anyone famous and covered by the media. In his small apartment, Brian did not eat dinner. He did not turn on the TV, nor touch his phone. He sat by the window, the dim light casting an oddly calm face. In his hands was a copy of an old file. The cover creased, the case name almost faded. It was one of dozens of investigations he had followed for years. Cases where those in power escaped punishment simply because no one saw, no one recorded, and no one could force the system to speak out. He turned each page slowly, as if reading his own life again. But this time, what rose in him was not anger. It was something else, colder, deeper, determination. No longer waiting for the system to fix itself. No longer believing in internal reviews. He made no statement to the press, wrote nothing on social media, posted no personal declaration. There was only one thing he did. He opened the worn investigative notebook and wrote a line. This time, I will not stop halfway. The light in the room stayed on late into the night. Outside, protesters began to grow in number, holding up signs demanding justice. No one knocked on Brian's door. No one called to urge him, but he knew time was running out. In the dark, he opened his laptop, not to check the news, but to write his first report. Request for internal investigation, the Crowley case, and related commanding officers. The next morning, Brian arrived at the Ridgepoint Police Department headquarters. His appointment had been confirmed by a secretary's mechanical voice. Captain Garrett will see you at 9:30. No one met him at the door. No escort. He walked alone down the long corridor, catching furtive glances from half-open office doors. A few officers who saw him quickly turned away. The polite nods he once received vanished as if they had never happened. Garrett's office was at the end of the hall. The door opened exactly on time. He rose from behind his desk, impeccably dressed in a buttoned-up white shirt with a gleaming steel watch on his wrist. Garrett offered a congenial smile and extended his hand. "Director Hayes, it's an honor to meet you. Please accept our apologies for yesterday's incident. We are still verifying the facts." Brian did not shake hands. He merely nodded and sat down in the chair opposite. Garrett withdrew his hand without expression and turned toward the coffee machine. "I understand the media reaction has been somewhat excessive," Garrett began in a calm, courteous tone. "We regret the situation you experienced, but as you know, some actions at the scene may have been misinterpreted. Officer Crowley may have reacted hastily, but we must review all the data before drawing any conclusion." Brian remained silent. He produced a file from his leather satchel and placed it on the desk. Inside were a copy of the video clip, a sketch of the incident, statements from 3 witnesses, and still images of his FBI badge captured by independent cameras. "I'm not here to demand an apology," he said. "I'm here to request an independent investigation, not handled by your internal affairs but by a third party appointed by the Department of Justice." Garrett offered a polite chuckle and shook his head. "Mr. Hayes, you know the process. Cases like this are first reviewed by the Internal Conduct Review Board. Only if there's evidence of serious wrongdoing will we consider expanding the inquiry." Brian's tone remained steady. "The video speaks for itself. Crowley not only used excessive force, he kicked a non-resisting individual and hurled insults without verifying identity. If I hadn't shown my badge, who knows where this would have gone?" Garrett pressed his lips together and said nothing. After a few seconds, he leaned back and shifted his tone. "You are FBI. We want to maintain interagency harmony. Stirring up the media could damage the reputation of the entire system." He emphasized each word. Sometimes what is legally right shouldn't be publicly amplified. Brian stood and gathered his file. He would not let Garrett take it. At the threshold he paused, turned back, and, his voice low and resolute, fixed Garrett with his gaze. Your silence is complicity. No one spoke. Garrett made no attempt to call him back. The door closed behind Brian, leaving an unshakable stillness. Immediately after leaving the precinct, Brian returned to his federal office on the 8th floor. Without stopping at reception or greeting anyone, he closed his office door, opened his laptop, and began a new document, compilation of Ridgepoint PD misconduct, request for federal investigation. He knew the system wouldn't self-correct. As a first step, Brian formed an independent fact-finding team of 3 trusted colleagues from the Criminal Investigations Division. No approval required, only righteous purpose. Over 2 days, they compiled every Crowley misconduct complaint from the past 8 years, civilian allegations, use of force reports, and quickly shelved internal affairs investigations. With no documented rationale, he went further, tracing complaints originally submitted to Captain Garrett's office, files that mysteriously vanished before reaching the review board. Brian emailed a senior DOJ legal advisor asking for the formal procedure to initiate an escalated investigation when local authorities refused to cooperate. 12 hours later came the reply. It's possible, if evidence shows command-level negligence or unauthorized interference with internal investigations. Brian refocused on that standard. Then a neutral data entry technician unaffiliated with any unit alerted him to a pattern. Over the last 3 years, every use of force complaint underwent editorial changes before official submission to Garrett's office. Metadata revealed edits by a specific group of accounts, all logging in via a proxy at the captain's command post. Reports were altered from excessive force to appropriate response, repeatedly naming Crowley among the officers involved. This revelation was the spark in dry tinder. As soon as Brian shifted the inquiry, several previously silent insiders reached out. Not many, but enough to start a ripple. Personal email tips, off-the-record statements, brief audio recordings, just enough to prove a cover-up. One of the first was a county prosecutor who'd been threatened while handling a case tied to Garrett's officers. She contacted Brian, requesting to submit her original file, removed from court 3 years ago. I've kept it, she said, not out of fear, but waiting for the right person to demand it. Brian felt no anger, no room for emotion, only clarity. The system's rotting core was finally exposed. This wasn't just Crowd's case anymore. It was a structure built on mutual protection through silence, sham procedures, and empty rules. He opened a fresh document and typed the opening line of the most comprehensive report of his career. Federal investigation proposal, Captain Garrett case, evidence of systemic internal manipulation and negligence. The FBI's electronic archives aren't on the ground floor, nor protected by a steel door like in spy movies. They exist within a grid-style internal network, tiered by access level and 3-layer authentication. Brian sat alone at his workstation, entering a specialized code string he filtered by location, Ridgepoint. Next, use of excessive force. The suspended before conclusion. 8 prominent cases appeared. He opened them one by one. Case 1. A young black man arrested in a parking lot after police suspected theft. No evidence. A witness existed, but their testimony was altered. File conclusion, subject resisted. Case 3. A Latino man was shoved at a checkpoint, sustaining a spinal fracture. Conclusion, accidental. All records shared common traits, no video, no full audio, and final approval signed by individuals still in office. The 6th dossier made Brian pause longer. A shooting. The victim was a 50-year-old black man, unarmed, shot 4 times in front of his home. The report cited signs of resistance, but the wife's handwritten statement said her husband only opened the door after a loud knock. The file was closed 48 hours later, with no further investigation. The officer, Crowley. Brian sat motionless, not from surprise, but because it confirmed his darkest suspicion. Crowley wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but a cog in a machine that had run too smoothly for too long. He began taking notes, not on the computer, not via email, handwritten line by line, case codes, dates, anomalies, then stored in a separate folder. Each copy was encrypted and locked in his personal safe. He knew that if he revealed them too soon, he'd not only be unprotected but face retaliation. He had to be solid, airtight, and unmistakable. A soft knock sounded. His assistant entered, saying little, placing a thick dossier bound with a rubber band on the desk. A handwritten note read, "This is all I could get without raising questions." Brian opened it to find copies of internal investigation reports, many stamped unreleased, showing initial conclusions unfavorable to the police, later amended. He looked at his assistant, who offered a slight bow, aware of the weight he carried. No thanks were spoken, but it was the first sign that not everyone in the system was innocent. A few, though cautious, had begun to shift, not because Brian convinced them, but because they could no longer pretend. Change didn't arrive en masse, it came quietly, like doors closing one by one without a sound. Colleagues who once fought alongside Brian in complex operations now avoided his meetings. Emails once answered in minutes now lingered for hours without reply. When responses came, they were terse, busy, will review later. A chance check of the internal meeting schedule revealed a closed session among senior supervisors about his organized crime investigation proposal. His name was absent. When he inquired, his superior replied flatly, "Just a technical meeting, not related to your work." A technical unit that once extracted old data also refused. Reason? New regulations require approval from 2 leadership levels. Brian didn't ask further. He understood. This wasn't a process change, but an unspoken signal. In a short hallway near the federal conference room, he encountered a former partner from a kidnapping case 6 years ago. Asked about an old archive record, the colleague whispered, "I don't want to be transferred," then hurried away. Brian stood alone, sensing that the distance between them was measured not in feet, but in growing fear. He felt neither surprise nor anger. The fissure existed long before him. He merely struck its weak point. What concerned him wasn't the silence, but how the system shielded itself, not with open resistance, but by tightening every screw, sealing every gap, as if repelling a foreign body. That evening, Brian sat alone in the dark office. He opened his old investigation notebook, flipped to a blank page, and with a black pen wrote and underlined twice, "Don't expect anyone to stand by you. Let the truth stand." No pats on the shoulder, no applause. Yet in that silence, he knew, every real movement begins quietly, and once you reach the deepest layer of silence, either you'll be suffocated by it, or you'll force it to reveal the truth. On a gloomy afternoon, the light from the computer screen was the only thing illuminating Brian's tense face. He was reviewing internal files, focusing on cases with signs of misconduct that had been closed prematurely or handled internally without prosecution. A file appeared under the section "Internal Conclusion No Further Action," the officer's name, Jack Crowley. Brian frowned. This file was not part of the cases he had been reviewing, but the name was unmistakable. He opened the file, and memories flooded back immediately. The incident happened 4 years earlier, in a parking lot on the west side of the city. The victim was a 19-year-old black youth with no prior record, arrested for suspicious behavior. Surveillance cameras at the scene recorded the entire incident, showing the young man did not resist but was still thrown down, suffering a shoulder injury and needing emergency care. Crowley was the officer who filed the report. His report stated the suspect was uncooperative, forcing the officer to use restraint. But footage from a nearby store showed the opposite. Crowley actively approached and grabbed the victim by the collar as soon as the young man asked why he was being detained. The internal affairs team at the time clearly concluded Officer Crowley showed signs of inappropriate use of force. Recommendation for Level 2 discipline, suspension, transfer, or contract termination. Brian, newly appointed as Deputy Director for the Eastern Region, had the authority to approve this recommendation. He recalled the meeting that day. Crowley was summoned to the office. He sat upright, spoke little, but did not avoid eye contact. When questioned, he offered no excuses or blame. He only said, I overreacted. I recognize my mistake. I am willing to undergo retraining. Brian, a believer in second chances, especially for young officers without prior disciplinary records, noted in the file, insufficient grounds for permanent dismissal. Recommend warning and behavior monitoring for 12 months. The discipline was reduced. Crowley retained his position and only participated in a week-long retraining course. At that time, Brian did not think much of it. He believed his act of forgiveness was a long-term investment in maturity. Crowley was seen by some superiors as tough, principled, but willing to learn. Those words led Brian to give him a chance to turn around. Now, reading every line in the file again, Brian felt no anger, but the disappointment was like a silent cut. He did not need anyone to point out that he had once pulled Crowley back from the edge, and now that same man was the one who forced him to kneel in the park before cameras and hundreds of witnesses, not because he did not know who Brian was, but because he did not think it mattered. Brian closed the file, gripping his neck, eyes staring into space. Years of believing in change, believing in goodness that can correct mistakes, were torn apart by a simple truth. Some people never want to change. The last thought echoed cold and clear in his mind. Sometimes, the one who pushes you down is not the enemy, but the one you once reached out to pull up. Brian sat silently in his office, the desk lamp shining down on the old file he had just read for the third time. The memory of that day, 4 years ago, returned vividly enough to send chills down his spine. Crowley sat upright, steady-eyed, with a demeanor just enough to inspire trust. Brian had believed that the man before him, despite past mistakes, could still change, believed that a chance could save a person. In the file, his own handwriting clearly stated, "Do not dismiss. Retrain and monitor performance for 12 months. Now, that very file had become evidence against him, not in court, but in the battlefield of conscience. He thought of the things never written down. If he had chosen differently that day, if he had not believed, not forgiven, would today's events have happened? Would Crowley have had the chance to repeat his behavior, an escalated level, and if so, who were the victims afterward? How many people had suffered, kept silent, never recorded in any reports, simply because the system was not transparent enough? Brian did not know, and that was what made him restless. Not because of the mistakes, because he might have contributed to their continuation, but he did not let himself drown in regret. He refused to slip into the easy feeling of excusing himself. He took back the file, marked the points to be disclosed, and prepared documents to submit to the independent review committee. Nothing held back anymore. No personal trust prioritized over organizational rules. This time, he chose justice, not because the system demanded it, but because he owed it to himself. In a closed meeting with the Department of Justice advisor, Brian opened the file, placed it on the table, and pushed it slightly forward. His voice was steady, devoid of anger. "Start with this. If I was wrong to trust him, then the system is wrong to place forgiveness in the hands of someone without oversight mechanisms." The counterpart did not respond immediately, but it was unnecessary. That statement was enough to establish the stance and a new direction for the entire case. That evening, when he returned home, Brian opened his personal diary. The notebook had accompanied him since his days as a district investigator, each page a testimony, a case, a torment. He flipped to the last blank page and wrote a line. "I forgave you then, but I do not forgive this time." No erasures, no corrections. The letters slanted, heavy like an internal verdict. Then he signed the request to reopen Crowley's disciplinary file. It was no longer just part of a new investigation, but the first step for him to reach the ultimate truth. Despite facing the consequences of what he once believed, Brian knew well this was the only way for the truth not to be forgotten again. The invitation came on a Monday morning, through a mutual acquaintance within the Department of Justice. The intermediary emphasized that Garrett wanted to de-escalate tensions and hoped for a conversation between two longtime colleagues. No official documents, No internal meeting schedule, just a private meeting under the guise of reconciliation. The venue chosen was a small hotel located on the west side of the city, discreet, not affiliated with the police department, nor near the administrative headquarters. A private meeting room, soundproof, with no permanent staff. Everything was arranged for safety and privacy, according to the intermediary. The reason sounded plausible, but the timing was too convenient. Brian had just released part of a preliminary investigation, the first signs of forced confessions and internal record tampering under Garrett's tenure. Immediately after, the invitation was extended. He sat in his office, looking at the simply printed invitation card without any official logo. The coffee on the table had gone cold, but his mind did not slow down. Garrett was not the type to invite someone for a casual talk. If he wanted reconciliation, it meant he wanted to control something, either the narrative, the evidence, or both. He folded the card and put it into his briefcase. Then he called only one person, Julia Kern, an independent investigative reporter who had accompanied him in exposing 2 high-level corruption cases. No greetings, no beating around the bush. Brian said plainly, "I need you to plant recording devices. Disguise them well. Send your people to the hotel 10 minutes before me." Julia responded shortly. "How many angles?" 4. Priority on his face and the equipment he carries. The call ended. No further explanation needed. She understood, and Brian knew well the game had begun. The next morning, Brian arrived on time, without bodyguards or lawyers. Simple attire. White shirt, dark trousers, no badge. To an unsuspecting eye, he was just a middle-aged official trying to maintain professionalism amid a media crisis. Garrett waited outside the meeting room. His face was different than usual. No coldness, instead a polite smile, hand extended in friendliness. "I'm glad you came, Brian," he said, his tone moderate, as if Brian's investigation was a misunderstanding at a wedding party. Brian shook his hand but said nothing. He only nodded slightly and stepped inside. No hotel staff, no witnesses. On the meeting table, only a bottle of mineral water, 2 glass cups, and a small black recorder labeled guest recording device. But with Brian's experience, a quick glance revealed it was no ordinary recorder. It was a specialized device. Smaller, equipped with directional microphones, often used in special negotiation. Garrett gestured to sit. He poured water and pushed a glass toward Brian. His voice remained gentle and calm. "I just want us to find a way so no one gets hurt further. The media is blowing things out of proportion, internal chaos. I believe that among those who understand the system like us, we can still sit down together." Brian did not touch the water, nor interrupt. He sat quietly, eyes fixed straight, and did not look away from the corner of the table where the recorder sat under the ceiling light. Garrett was starting his game, but Brian knew clearly he was not the only one holding cards. Garrett began with vague stories. The system was chaotic, officers were discontented, and public opinion was divided. He used loss of trust instead of misconduct. He said process instead of cover-up. In every sentence, he tried to keep the image of a noble commander, someone bearing responsibility for his subordinates. Brian did not interrupt, barely reacted. Each time Garrett paused, waiting for a signal, Brian only nodded slightly or remained silent. Garrett began to lose patience. "You know I'm not the cleanest guy," Garrett said, voice lowered, "but I've kept this system from collapsing, one way or another. You've done the same, haven't you?" Brian looked up. "I never falsify testimonies." Garrett chuckled lightly, showing no sign of hurt. "Sometimes tearing up a piece of paper saves a life. I'm not ashamed of that." A pause. Then he changed his tone. "I hear you have some recordings from old investigations, things unverified. If made public, they'd ruin a lot. Not just me, but you too." That was when Brian knew he was right. Garrett was trying to pressure him into compromise, luring him to back down by implying the risk of both sinking. "You still have a chance," Garrett continued, hand near the recorder. "Withdraw from the public eye. Stop releasing the documents. I'll take just enough responsibility. No one goes to jail, no one loses face. Brian looked straight into his eyes. Exactly what are you proposing? Take a step back. Let me handle the rest. I've cleaned up messes more complicated than this. The recorder was still running, but Brian knew well that device was not the real evidence. Behind the meeting room door, in the third-floor hallway, 2 reporters from Julia Kern's team monitored via special signal receivers. Another, disguised as room service staff, had placed a tiny camera on a water bottle atop the fridge in the corner. They had recorded everything. Every leading question, every time Garrett tried to set a shared fault trap, and the final moment when Garrett said, "If you stay stubborn, I can't guarantee you'll keep your position or your reputation." Brian smiled, the first smile throughout the meeting. "You have the right to try." He stood up, said no more, gently folded the draft paper, put it in his pocket, and walked out. Garrett stood, called after him something, but was cut off by the door closing. 24 hours later, a short video was released on an independent channel managed by Julia's team. The clip was brief, just over 3 minutes, but clear enough to show Garrett fabricating reconciliation, coaching testimony, and secretly threatening. The closing narration was Julia's. "When the system tries to disguise threats with a gentle voice, we need someone who won't respond but expose it." Garrett watched the news in his office. His face turned pale. For the first time, he did not pull out his phone, did not call anyone, did not order a media counterattack. He just stood still. Because for the first time in his life, he was caught on camera while losing control, and he knew he was no longer in command. After the identity of the boy filming was revealed, a fierce wave of debate erupted. The local police found themselves on the defensive. Every social media post was now tagged with the name Ridgepoint as a symbol of justice's failure. But while the media focused on the Peterson family, Brian remained silent. He did not make statements. He refused interviews. Yet inside his office, he quietly sketched out a new diagram. A map of those who had stepped out of the system with eyes still able to look back. A list was compiled. Names of administrative staff, data technical teams, those unarmed but who once held pens that recorded an era of concealment. That morning, Brian's encrypted personal inbox received an anonymous email. The subject line contained just 6 words: "Don't let it all get buried." The message was a short paragraph, so brief it could not be shortened. Garrett personally destroyed records when someone sued Crowley for violent conduct in 2020. The originals were not destroyed. They remain in the old basement archive. File code 7C414. The entrance is now locked. Brian immediately forwarded the content to the technical team to check metadata, IP routing, and anonymizing layers. No results. All traces were clean, as if carefully wiped before sending. But one thing could not be hidden: the writing style. Terms like destroy transfer, file code, or old archive floor, not phrases used by journalists or ordinary people. This was internal notation, commonly used in personnel management and administrative archiving. Brian quickly jotted a line in his notebook. Sender is a former Ridgepoint administrative staff member, no longer active, possibly still has access rights. At noon, Brian convened a secret meeting with just 2 people: Maria Jennings, Deputy Director of Investigatio SS, and the lawyer responsible for data expertise. "I'm going to the police department tomorrow afternoon, under the name of a federal legal advisor inspecting archives, per the Administrative Data Protection Act. I need a paper order sufficient so no one asks too many questions, but also enough to open inactive areas." Maria frowned. "You plan to go alone?" Brian nodded. "That was my place. If I bring others, they will be cautious." The next afternoon, the plan was set. An unmarked federal vehicle transported Brian to the administrative building of the Ridgepoint Police Department. In his hand was a hard file, not only a survey order but also a color printout copy of the anonymous email. Before stepping out, Brian handed the copy to Maria. His voice was slow, firm, and cold. "If I don't return within 2 hours, consider this the first piece of evidence, and find the sender. They are no longer anonymous." Aria tightened her grip on the papers. She did not ask more, did not stop him, only watched the back of the man walking into the building that once tried to break him. This time, with a single goal, to redraw the boundary between destroy, transfer documents, and living evidence. In Brian's mind, only one number remained, 7C14, and behind it, the first truth, never spoken. Brian walked down the narrow passage behind the old administrative archive room. This basement area had once been managed by the logistics department, now closed and replaced by a northern digital data warehouse. But no one removed the old lock, and Brian, who had signed off the handover process, knew exactly where files not yet scanned into the new system were kept. The door was locked with a mechanical code. No electricity, no cameras. He punched in 4 numbers, 8714, the last access code for the paper record system before Garrett took over. A soft click sounded. The door opened with a musty, moldy, cold metallic smell, like a cellar rejected by history. Brian switched on a wrist-mounted flashlight. Rows of old steel filing cabinets appeared, reaching the ceiling. Each row was coded by decade, from 1995 to 2021. He quickly scanned the compartments marked 7C. The last compartment on the right bore the label 7C14, the number from the anonymous email. The mechanical lock was still intact, but the screws showed signs of having been tightened again. Someone had opened it and tried to close it tightly afterward. Brian used a multi-tool to open the lock. Inside was a hard file bag wrapped in a moisture-proof pouch. The outside bore no name, only a faded barcode sticker. He opened it. Inside were 1 handwritten testimony, 1 crime scene inspection report, 3 color photocopied pages with faded text, and most importantly, a silver external hard drive labeled archive_B17. He carefully rewrapped everything and put it into an anti-jetic cloth bag he had brought, but as he turned to leave, his flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, revealing a tiny camera in a dark corner, almost covered by dust. Brian froze for half a second. That camera was not part of the old archive system. It was a temporary surveillance camera, used for unofficial internal monitoring. Someone knew, or was watching. Without changing direction, he continued out, locked the door as before, exiting the basement, passing through the old logistics corridor, and back into the administrative area. Outside, a young officer stopped him and checked his papers. Brian showed his federal ID and access order. The officer glanced over, then nodded, but his eyes betrayed suspicion. "We were not informed anyone was going to the basement today." Brian smiled. "The basement is not part of the regular report. It's a place meant to be forgotten, isn't it?" He turned and walked away, not letting the officer ask more. As the vehicle moved off, Brian said nothing. He lightly touched the hard drive's case, its cold metal feeling like a silent heartbeat in the dark. That night, in his private office, Brian and Julia connected the hard drive to an isolated, secure system. Inside were 14 folders, coded by year and file number. Some files were corrupted, but most were intact. Especially one never-before-published CLI, recording the interrogation of a black youth in 2020. No lawyer, no transcript, and Garrett's voice, clear in the recording, "You better talk or I'll make your mother stand outside the hallway all night." Brian clenched his fists tightly. Beneath 5 years of dust, a part of the truth had finally surfaced, and it did not need to be adjusted with any fancy words. An invitation arrived on Monday morning via a mutual contact at the Department of Justice. The messenger emphasized that Garrett wants to de-escalate the tension and hopes for a private discussion between 2 longtime former colleagues. There was no official memo, no internal meeting notice, just a one-on-one session under the guise of reconciliation. The venue chosen was a discreet small hotel on the city's west side, unconnected to the police department and far from any government offices. A soundproof private conference room with no permanent staff had been arranged for security and privacy, according to the intermediary. The reason sounded plausible, but The timing was too perfect. Brian had just released preliminary findings, initial signs of coerced confessions, and erased internal records under Garrett's command. Immediately afterward, the invitation came. He sat at his desk, staring at the plain invitation card, bearing no official logo. His coffee had gone cold, but his mind raced. Garrett was not one to invite someone out of courtesy. If he wanted a meeting, it meant he was trying to control something. Either the narrative, the evidence, or both. He folded the card, slipped it into his briefcase, then called exactly one person, Julia Kern, an independent investigative reporter who had collaborated with him on 2 high-level corruption exposés. Without greeting or small talk, Brian said, "I need you to plant recording devices. Conceal them thoroughly. Send your team in 10 minutes before me." Julia replied tersely, "How many angles?" 4. "Prioritize his face and any equipment he brings." The call ended. No further explanation was needed. She understood, and Brian knew the game had begun. The next morning, Brian arrived precisely on time, unaccompanied by bodyguards or lawyers. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, with no badge displayed. To any unobservant bystander, he looked like a mid-level official trying to maintain professionalism amid a media storm. Garrett stood outside the conference room door, his expression uncharacteristically warm, greeting Brian with a courteous smile and an outstretched hand. "I'm glad you came, Brian," he said in a measured tone, as though Brian's investigation were merely a misunderstanding at a wedding reception. Brian shook his hand, but said nothing, merely nodded and entered. There were no hotel staff present, no witnesses. On the table sat only a bottle of water, 2 glasses, and a small black recorder labeled Guest Audio Service. Brian recognized at a glance that it was no ordinary recorder, but a specialized device, compact, with directional microphones, typically used in special negotiations. Garrett gestured to a chair, poured water, and pushed a glass toward Brian. In his calm, composed voice, he said, "I just want us to find a way to avoid further harm. The media is overblowing this. The department is in chaos. I believe that, as insiders, we can still sit down and talk." Brian did not touch the glass or interrupt. He sat still, eyes fixed on the recorder's location under the overhead light. Garrett began his opening gambit, speaking of general issues: a fractured bureaucracy, disgruntled officers, and a divided public. He used terms like damage to trust instead of misconduct, and process instead of cover-up. In every sentence, he painted himself as a noble leader, bearing the burden for his subordinates. Brian remained silent, merely nodding occasionally, never reacting. Frustration crept into Garrett's voice. "You know I'm not squeaky clean," Garrett admitted in a lower tone, "but I've kept this system from collapsing one way or another. You used to do the same, didn't you?" Brian looked up. "I've never torn up a sworn statement." Garrett smiled, unbothered. "Sometimes ripping up a piece of paper saves a life. I'm not ashamed of that." A pause followed before he shifted tone. "I hear you have some unverified recordings from past investigations. If released, they'd ruin a lot of people. Not just me, but you as well." That was when Brian knew he hadn't misjudged Garrett's intent. He was being pressured to compromise, lured into backing off by the threat of mutual destruction. "You still have a choice," Garrett continued, hand inching toward the recorder. "Withdraw from the public eye. Stop publishing documents. I'll take just enough blame. No one goes to jail. No one loses face." Brian stared directly at him. "What exactly are you proposing? Step back and let me handle the rest. I've managed worse crises than this." The recorder kept running, but Brian knew it wasn't the real evidence. In the hallway on the 3rd floor, 2 of Julia Kern's reporters monitored via specialized signal receivers. Another, disguised as room service, had planted a tiny camera on the water dispenser in the corner. They captured every coaxing phrase, every implication of shared guilt, and the pivotal moment when Garrett warned, "If you persist, I can't guarantee you position or your reputation." Brian cracked the first smile of the meeting. "You have the right to try." He stood, folded his notepad without another word, and walked out. Garrett called after him, but the door closed mid-utterance. 24 hours later, Julia's independent news channel aired a short clip, not much over 3 minutes, but clear enough to show Garrett feigning conciliation, coercing, and threatening. The segment ended with Julia's commentary. When a system masks threats in soft tones, we need someone who won't respond in kind, but expose it. Garrett watched the broadcast in his office, his face drained of color. For once, he did not grab his phone, call for a rebuttal, or order a media offensive. He simply stood still, because, for the first time, he had been filmed losing control. He knew then he was no longer in charge. The old digital archives at Ridgepoint Police Department sat tucked behind the dilapidated administration building, seldom mentioned in official systems. On paper, all data had been transferred in 2021, when Garrett took command. But Brian used to work there. He remembered clearly. Some hard drives weren't migrated because they were too large or not yet approved for circulation. Some were sealed, others deliberately forgotten. That evening, Brian arrived at the old building's gate. No patrol car, no escort. In plain clothes and a baseball cap, he carried a bag containing a laptop and a specialized data reader, tools Julia had provided earlier. Inside, he also brought a pristine white hard drive, never connected to the internet, to copy anything left behind. The building was pitch dark, but the side gate still used its old mechanical code lock. Brian entered the maintenance code he'd used as a crime scene inspector. The iron door swung open with a dry click, like a long-forgotten sigh. He walked down the corridor to the basement, once a mixed physical and digital data vault. Faint sensor lights flickered as he moved, and the air smelled of paper dust, rusty metal, and old preservative chemical. He located row 3 of cabinet 3 and found a small safe secured by a 3-digit mechanical lock. 1 turn, 2 turns. On the third, his hand hesitated for a second, then clicked into place. The door swung open. Inside lay an old matte deck portable drive labeled in pencil B12/Arch. No barcode, no electronic record number, meaning it had never gone through any official storage process. Whatever was inside might never have been touched, or no one dared touch it. He placed the drive in an anti-stemic pouch and wrapped it carefully. As he turned to leave, he heard a faint sound from the staircase, like someone shifting or stepping back. Brian didn't look over his shoulder. He knew the best reflex now was to remain calm, as if he had heard nothing. He retraced his steps, walking steadily without stopping at any junction, without checking behind him. At the side exit, he re-entered the code and closed the iron door as gently as he could. Everything felt like a routine maintenance check. Only when he sat in his apartment, plugging the drive into an independent backup station, did his hand tremble for a few seconds. The directory tree appeared. Cryptic folder names arranged by year and case. Brian didn't rush to open anything. He merely noted the last folder's title, Review, with a simple annotation below, requested for deletion, awaiting Garrett's approval. His heart clenched. He didn't yet know exactly what he'd uncovered, but his instinct told him. This data wouldn't just aid the investigation, it could redefine the very nature of this system. In a windowless, secure room lit only by 2 large screens and a single desk lamp over a long wooden table, Brian and Julia sat facing each other. On screen, each folder opened in turn. Lines of data scrolled slowly, revealing names, dates, and silent case codes, rising like ghosts from the past. 14 cases in total, all from Garrett's first year as commander and spanning 6 years. Most had never been logged in the official system. Some marked handled internally, others lacking any case number, as though they'd never existed. Julia whispered, "This isn't just oversight. It's erasure." Every case shared one trait. The complainant was a person of color, mostly men under 30. Some had been arrested for vague reasons like disturbing the peace or failure to comply. But deeper scrutiny revealed something darker. Some cases had no evidence, only police statements, and the victims vanished. 2 deaths stood out. 1 inmate died in custody, reportedly by shoelace strangulation. Another died from jumping from a moving patrol car. Yet in an attached audio clip, an officer said over the radio, he was thrashing too much. 1 kick and it's done. Julia's voice trembled as she opened the next folder. internal clips labeled pending cut. They watched a senior officer forcing a woman to sign a withdrawal of complaint. He said plainly, "Sign it. We'll make sure your family wants for nothing." Brian murmured, "Promises like that," and paused, only surface when a truth is buried. Tension peaked when they opened the final file, Personal GX. Inside lay an encrypted ledger. Using Julia's decryption tool, they quickly decoded it. It listed off-budget payments, unaccounted for in official audits, funneled through a shell company's account. Next to each payment, Deputy Donovich, Deputy Rivera, Assistant Director Howard, all Garrett's trusted subordinates. Brian reflected, this is silence paid for. But what made him stop cold was entry 8, Jalen Brooks, deceased, a sophomore at Illinois State University. The name matched, and so did the year of death. Brian remembered the photograph a distraught mother had brought to a congressional hearing just months ago. She insisted, "My son didn't kill himself. I just want someone to investigate properly." Now there was nothing left to investigate. Everything was laid bare. Brian looked at Julia, his voice low but resolute. "We haven't just retrieved data. We've exhumed a graveyard." Julia fell silent. She knew from this moment on they were up against more than an individual. They faced a mechanism built on fear, silence, and the blood of those who knelt unseen. That night, the city press headquarters had no officially registered press conference, but when the name Brian Hayes appeared on the list of speakers, it took less than 20 minutes for the media to fill the entire third-floor corridor. Everyone knew this was no ordinary meeting, and Brian, wearing a simple white shirt, no badge, no title insignia, chose to enter silently, carrying a thin black briefcase and an external hard drive. He stood straight before the microphone. Behind him was a black curtain without the FBI logo or Department of Justice emblem, just a plain, cold wall. "I will not answer questions after this session," he said evenly. "What needs to be said will be within the next 6 minutes." No one stirred. Brian turned on the projector. On the screen was a summary table titled Concealed Evidence from 2016 to Present. A video played, audio faint but clear enough with Crowley's voice. "We have orders from above. If there's a case, let Garrett review and decide." The phrase was cut but repeated twice. At the second minute, the video switched to a photo of an email bearing Garrett's electronic signature approving case closure, even though the internal inspector's conclusion stated further investigation needed due to signs of coercion. The entire room fell silent. Brian gave no explanation, no comment. He only showed another image, the 2018 case file, the victim, a 15-year-old black teenage R accused of carrying an illegal weapon. Attached documents included a photo of the G without fingerprint and a note crossed out faintly, evidence of unclear origin. A young reporter stood up. "Are you implying manipulation from higher-ups?" Brian replied simply, "I'm not implying, I'm disclosing." The atmosphere sank again. He stopped the video, turned off the projector. Everything returned to stillness. "I have sent all documents to the Department of Justice and the Independent Review Committee. I represent no faction. I represent only justice, the one abandoned by those in uniform." No applause, no cheers, only rapid keyboard typing and flashing cameras. Brian closed his briefcase and left the podium without looking back. He did not expect a claim, nor did he want to justify himself. News spread within less than 10 minutes. FBI Eastern Region Director exposes concealed data directly targeting police leadership. Crowley was suspended just 3 hours later. Garrett immediately called a private meeting, but public opinion was out of control. For the first time in many years, a link in the security system was unmasked, not by the press, nor by an outside organization, but by someone within. Brian drove home. He did not turn on the radio, did not check his phone. He just sat behind the wheel, hands clenched, thinking of two things. The truth had begun to be revealed, and the system would not stay silent. That same night, the city police office posted a suspension notice for Jack Crowley. The brief message read, "Suspended from duties pending internal investigation. effective immediately. Before public opinion cooled, Garrett was pulled into the storm. On television, he answered interviews with a confident tone. "We have never overlooked any violation if there was clear evidence." But behind the scenes, Garrett urgently convened a closed meeting. For the first time, some senior officers refused to attend. Bryan said nothing more after the press conference. He only sent 3 emails, one to the Department of Justice, one to the Internal Oversight Committee, and one to the independent inspection body he had proposed to establish. He attached all released documents, plus unrevealed parts, a list of cases halted during Garrett's tenure as regional supervisor. The first response came from the Department of Justice. "We have assigned a special assessment team which will arrive on site within 48 hours. The system started moving. A temporary inspection team was sent to take over access to the record management system at the local police department. They carried orders to collect data and independent backups. Garrett angrily protested, claiming interference with administrative autonomy, but no one defended him. No objections were recorded in the meeting minutes. In his private office, Bryan maintained the habit of handwriting. On the whiteboard hung beside the window, he erased all case names. Now only 2 words remained, written in bold black ink, underlined in red: Garrett and complicity. A young assistant entered, placing an anonymous envelope on his desk. Inside was the printed 2018 budget, with strange expense items, costs for internal security maintenance, unclear recipient reimbursements, and a data confidentiality fee signed by Garrett himself. Bryan opened his laptop. He created a new folder named core_root. All evidence was sequentially uploaded, the first encryption layer marked by the dates of suddenly stopped investigations. He knew the big blow had not yet come, but the system was starting to crack, and when it cracks, no one will be fast enough to patch it up with lies. At the city council, members began to split. A councilman loyal to Garrett announced withdrawal from the upcoming hearing due to health reasons. Others openly demanded a federal inspection. The tension was no longer just between Bryan and Crowley or Bryan and Garrett, but between the true guardians of order and those exploiting it to conceal power. At the end of the day, Bryan received a single message from an unknown number. "Don't just look at the person, look at the structure that raised them." He stared at the bright white screen, did not reply. His hand rested on his chest, where a badge once lay. Now it was a void. But the emptiness was not to forget. It was to change everything from the root. At 11:37 at night, Bryan's phone rang. The number was unknown, no saved name, no area code. He was about to ignore it, but the ringing wouldn't stop, as if the caller knew he was still awake. He answered before he could speak. A hoarse, broken male voice, breathless from running, came through. "I can't sleep. We need to talk. Meet me at the usual place." Just one sentence, but enough for Bryan to understand. The usual place was the parking lot near the South Ridgepoint station, where a controversial arrest took place 4 years ago. Back then, Crowley, still a lieutenant, had pressed his knee on the neck of a black teenager, almost killing him. Bryan witnessed it, but the files were wiped clean within a week. He didn't forget, and Crowley certainly hadn't. Half an hour later, Bryan parked at the edge of the lot, the streetlights dim. No cameras. A silver sedan was parked 2 spaces away. The door opened. Crowley stepped out. No uniform, wearing a faded gray hoodie, dusty sneakers, staggering like someone who just survived a nightmare. He did not shake hands. No beating around the bush. "I thought I was going to be eliminated," he said bluntly. "If I don't speak out, no one else will." Bryan neither nodded nor objected. He waited. Crowley looked around, then lowered his head. "I used to think you were the type of colored guy who liked attention. Liked TV, but I was wrong. Garrett, he's not just racist, he manipulates everything." His voice carried no defense, no excuses. He began to tell, slowly, bit by bit, like prying open a long-healed wound. The internal meetings where Garrett privately called a few trusted officers and ordered them to clean up nuisances, meaning if victims had no influential relatives, files would be retired. destroyed by hand, leaving no digital trace. If suspects had no lawyers, strong methods were used to push them to confess. Officers who protested would be transferred to high-risk zones, a euphemism for career death. Brian clenched his fists. Why stay silent all that time? Crowley looked up, eyes sunken. Because I was cowardly. I thought if I behaved, I could keep my seat, my power, my pension. I thought silence was survival. He laughed bitterly. But then I realized that power didn't save me from the shadow I became. The yellow parking lot light shone down on the two once humiliated. One, once the perpetrator. Now they stood face to face, neither above the other. Only a prolonged silence remained, and a confession that could not be taken back. Crowley did not beg for forgiveness, nor seek sympathy. His eyes were only those of a man peeling away layers of lies he once used to cover his conscience. And for the first time, Brian did not see him as an office, but as a man fallen from the shell of power he once trusted as armor. The night wind blew through the lot, causing Crowley's faded hoodie to flutter slightly. He reached into his pocket, slowly pulling out a small object wrapped in black plastic. Not hurried, not trembling, like someone prepared for this moment long ago. This is what I once thought would protect me. Now, I have nothing to protect against. He handed Brian a small USB, no bigger than a thumb, but containing a dark memory of the system he once served. I backed it up from the old server, before Garrett wiped it clean. A raw copy. Incomplete, but enough to prove how he ran everything like a mafia on the payroll. Brian said nothing. He took it, checked the temporary seal. No sign of tampering. He wasn't lying, at least not tonight. What's in it? Brian asked, eyes fixed on the device. Arrest order distribution logs, oral orders were never documented, and 2 recordings of closed-door commander meetings. Garrett thought he'd deleted them, but I had access before he reconfigured the system. He inhaled deeply. One of the 2 has my voice. I don't deny it. Brian looked up, the headlights reflected in his eyes, cold and resolute. You know you'll have to stand trial. Crowley nodded, not avoiding. I know. They stood there a while longer. Neither moved. Brian placed his hand on Crowley's shoulder, not a gesture of forgiveness, but a final act, before stepping out of the darkness. At dawn, Brian arrived at the secondary secure office, where he stored sensitive data outside the federal system. Julia, his trusted partner, brought the offline decoder. Together, they plugged the USB into the isolated system. Data slowly appeared, folders of order notes, file codes, secret meeting schedules, and several audio clips. One recording of Garrett's voice rang out clearly. Don't let the death of an unknown kid ruin the whole unit. If necessary, transfer files, force confessions, and clean it up. Don't let people dig everything up just because of a stray black kid. Julia looked up, pale. He confessed on tape. Brian didn't reply. He opened the second clip. An internal meeting and Crowley's voice surfaced. Then he protested. Not loudly, not harshly, but clearly. We can't do that to an innocent. There are limits to oral orders, sir. Garrett responded. Limits are defined by me. Don't like it? Get out of line. Julia fell silent. Brian closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. He once protested, but then still did it. What will you do with him now? Brian was silent, then softly answered, no mercy. But he won't die in silence either. This truth must be brought to light, no matter who it comes from. Outside the glass door, dawn gradually rose, but the room remained silent. Only the soft whir of hard drives, the heartbeat of a system just beginning to awaken. The hard drive fit snugly in Brian's palm, but its weight seemed to bear down on the entire system. Crowley had kept it for years, not out of goodwill, but out of caution. And now, what once was a lifeline had become the evidence that could bring the whole system crashing down. Brian did not send it to the local prosecutor's office, nor did he trust the internal system. He walked straight into the Federal Department of Justice headquarters in D.C., demanding a direct meeting with the Attorney General. The appointment was arranged just hours later, but security was tightened. No one wanted this case to leak before official action was taken. In the closed meeting room, there were only 3 people: the Attorney General, a legal assistant, and Brian Hayes. He opened the metal box, took out the hard drive, and placed it on the table without saying another word. The Attorney General was a middle-aged Wama with graying hair at the temples and a calm, even voice. She did not ask Brian where he got it from. Instead, she opened the files, scrolling through folders labeled Interrogation Correction 4/2019, Off the Books Funding, Confidential, Report Deletion Order, in What do you want? She asked bluntly. Brian looked into her eyes, unwavering. Arrest Captain Garrett. Search his entire office within 48 hours, and I need an independent investigative unit, unrelated to any local agency. If you agree, I will hand over everything. She sat silently for about 10 seconds. Outside the frosted glass window, afternoon sunlight still shone, but inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with pressure. Finally, the Attorney General closed her laptop and concluded, "We will not allow anyone to wear the uniform and dishonor the law any longer. Garrett will be treated as a suspect, not a commander. You hand over the hard drive to us, and from now on, you will have full legal protection." Brian nodded, without smiling or showing relief. He knew this was only the beginning of a new phase. More tense, more intense, he handed over a second USB, a backup copy, then stood and left the room. As he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. "I know what you just did, but Garrett is more than just a facade. Be careful." He turned off the screen and continued walking. Ahead was the elevator. Behind him was a system fracturing piece by piece, and for the first time, it began to crack loudly. At 7 in the morning, a black, unmarked SUV stopped outside the Ridgepoint County Police Headquarters. Garrett had just entered his office when he was stopped in the third-floor hallway. 2 federal agents presented an arrest warrant issued by the Department of Justice, signed directly by the Attorney General the night before. Garrett did not resist. He froze for a few seconds, then raised his hands. Cold No-8 handcuffs snapped shut without warning. All this happened before dozens of subordinate officers who had long regarded him as the symbol of absolute power. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. Within less than 30 minutes, an emergency search warrant was executed. A special task force of 3 investigators, 2 technicians, and 1 federal prosecutor was dispatched to thoroughly search Garrett's office. From desks, safes, server hard drives, to locked drawers containing documents sealed for years. The first item found was an encrypted notebook hidden under the bottom of a chipped plywood drawer. It listed 26 internal off-the-record expenses associated with initials, among them JC and TH, matching 2 officers who were abruptly transferred after internal investigations. Next was a black and white printed document clipped inside an unlabeled folder. The content was a 2020 testimony record, in which original answers were crossed out and replaced with statements aligned to the official investigation's conclusion. At the bottom of each copy was Garrett's electronic signature, stamped Urgent Approva, indicating his direct role in coercion and report alteration. The final blow came from an old USB hidden in a paperclip box. Its data was an audio recording of an internal meeting where Garrett declared, "I don't care about right or wrong. My job is to keep this department out of the press. If I have to sacrifice a few pawns to protect the board, I will." The recording ended with a hand slamming on the table and a trembling voice replying, "But those are human lives, sir." When the search results were sent to the federal headquarters, the Attorney General left a brief directive. Move to long-term detention. Submit indictment files at the federal level. In the high-security detention center, Garrett remained utterly silent. He refused a private lawyer, did not answer reporters, and never mentioned any accomplices. Only once did he speak when the warden asked if he needed anything else. A blank sheet of paper and a blue ink pen. "Not to appeal. I need to write something. Final." At the Ridgepoint Police Headquarters, a heavy silence enveloped the place. A young officer named Willis, personally recruited by Garrett, quietly removed his badge from his uniform. placed it on the duty desk, and turned away without a word, a small gesture but signaling cracks spreading from within the system. No gunfire, no desperate chase, but the entire system was collapsing, layer by layer, and for the first time no one hurried to cover it up. The hard drive lay inside a cold gray metal box. Crowley said nothing as he handed it to Brian, merely nodding. His face had grown dark and hollow, nothing like the man who'd once shouted and kicked a black man to his knees in the park. Back in his office, Brian placed the box on his desk and stared at it, as if weighing an unexploded bomb. He knew that if he handed this data to the county prosecutor's office, it might vanish or be accidentally corrupted. Garrett had allies at every level. One wrong pair of hands, and it was over. He opened his phone's priority contacts and called the one person who still had true authority and independence, the U.S. Attorney General. An hour later, her secretary confirmed, "Mr. Hayes, the Attorney General will meet you at this afternoon's closed session in D.C." The meeting took place in a small soundproof room on the Justice Department's third floor. No press, no tech staff, only the Attorney General, her legal advisor, and Brian Hayes. Brian set the metal box on the table without a word. The Attorney General, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes, eyed it for a moment before opening it. Inside were classified documents, redacted reports, and off-the-book transfer logs bearing Garrett's own electronic signature. "What do you want?" she asked. Brian answered without hesitation. "A warrant for Captain Garrett's immediate arrest, a full search of his office within 48 hours, and an independent task force with 0 personnel, drawn from state or local law enforcement." The Attorney General was silent. Her advisor tapped through case numbers on a laptop in the hush of the room's ventilation. After a few minutes, she closed the computer and said firmly, "Garrett is a major link, but not the only one. I agree to your request on one condition. You will continue to support the expanded investigation." Brian nodded. "I never planned to withdraw." The meeting ended swiftly. The emergency order was issued that night. The hard drive was sealed and transferred to the high-security investigation unit. As he left the building, Brian's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No name, no signature. Garrett isn't just a surface layer. He has roots. He switched off the screen and tucked his phone into his jacket. The night air in D.C. was cold and dry, nothing like Ridgepoint's humid heat. Yet the real chill was coming from inside the system, and he knew this would not stop with one man. At 9 the next morning, 4 unmarked black SUVs rolled quietly up to Ridgepoint Police Headquarters. A federal task force streamed into the administrative wing bearing the arrest warrant and search order signed personally by the Attorney General. No sirens, no warnings, just decisive action. Garrett stepped out of his morning briefing to find 2 agents raising their badges. He blinked in surprise. "Is there some mistake?" He half smiled. The agents said nothing. They read him the charges and cuffed him. Not a single officer in the hallway spoke. Those who used to call him sir stood silently as he was led through the front doors, head bowed, but face composed. Meanwhile, another team unlocked and raided his private office. Every document was sealed, computers had their hard drives removed, and the safe was opened with codes extracted from internal records. In the deepest drawer, agents found a worn leather notebook detailing irregular expenditures, each line initialed with encrypted shorthand, JCRHDM, matching 3 officers involved in sudden transfers after internal complaints. They also uncovered an unmarked brown folder containing witness statements from 2020 to 2023. What stood out wasn't the content, but handwritten margin notes, crossed out passages replaced with rationalized conclusions, each page stamped with Garrett's electronic signature and an emergency approval code. The coup de grace was a small USB hidden in a paperclip box. When plugged into a secure workstation, it revealed a 40-minute internal recording of a closed-door meeting between Garrett and unit heads. On it, Garrett declared, "I don't care about right or wrong. We have one goal: to protect this department's reputation. If that means burying subordinate officers, so be it. so long as my position is safe. A trembling voice interjected, "But what if someone dies, sir?" Garrett replied coldly. "Then we find new witnesses." The audio was encrypted, but a typed transcript matched every word. When the evidence reached the federal office, Brian was summoned to authenticate it. He glanced at the recordings and said simply, "This is the part that Crowley wouldn't dare keep." In federal custody, Garrett refused a private attorney. When asked if he wanted representation, he answered, "I don't need protection. I just need paper and pen." That afternoon, Ridgepoint PD issued an internal memo. Any officer named in Garrett's notebook would face independent review. Some voluntarily resigned. Lieutenant Willis, promoted by Garrett 3 months early, stripped off his badge and walked out without looking back. No one spoke, and no one intervened. The precinct felt like the aftermath of an explosion. No blast, but the smoke still lingered. Brian received the final report near dusk. He didn't smile. He simply said, "A system doesn't collapse on its own. It rots in place and waits for someone to strike its breaking point." The South Ridgepoint Community Center had never been this full. Plastic chairs pressed together in rows, hushed conversations blending with the soft tapping of phones. Nobody knew who organized this meeting or who the speaker would be, yet people still came, some out of curiosity, some with angry glares, and others, elderly faces sitting silently, hands folded in their laps as if waiting for something long lost to return. Brian knew nothing of this gathering. He was at the office, buried in newly opened files concerning 3 city council members. An ordinary D, why unaware that his own mother, Eleanor Hayes, had quietly signed up to speak. Eleanor had taught at public school No. 12, deep in the predominantly black neighborhood where children received hand-me-down textbooks for Westist, Ridgepoint. Over 30 years, she had spoken up repeatedly about funding allocations, about unfair treatment of students of color, but her requests were dismissed as too sensitive or inconsistent with district priorities. At 58, she had accepted a voluntary retirement from the school board. Since then, she lived quietly in a small house, never in the news or community groups, only tending her garden and caring for her cats. Today, she wore a gray, ankle-length dress, a worn wool cardigan, and an earth-tone headscarf. When she stepped to the podium, there was no applause. Few recognized her, but she stood tall, set the microphone on the table, and spoke in a calm, clear voice. "I don't need an amplifier. I've spoken to more than 2,000 child Rionan. This voice, that's enough." She did not mention her son's name, nor praise his position or reputation. She told stories, measured, without melodrama. She spoke of parent-teacher meetings she was not invited to because the school already had enough community representatives. She recalled trying to rent a house downtown, only to be denied for insufficient credit history, though they owed nothing. She described walking 3 blocks to teach because the bus service in her area was suspended. And she shared how people like her chose silence and endurance so their children could live without being held back. She paused and scanned the room. Some bowed their heads, others held their breath. "I am not speaking to defend Brian Hayes," she said. "He is grown and knows how to stand. I speak for the generation forced to kneel, for the children told, 'Be quiet, endure, so you can stay in school.'" No one interrupted, no one dared. "If my child kneels," she concluded, "he kneels because his dignity was violated. But when he stands, I want the world to know he carries a generation that was made to bow." Her words did not thunder, but they resonated and spread. Someone stood and applauded quietly, then a second, then the entire hall. Not for the speech itself, but because they realized some truths, if unspoken today, would remain buried under history's dust. The next morning, a sophomore journalism student who sat in the back row uploaded a 6-minute, unedited clip of Eleanor's talk online, noting simply that there was something in her voice I couldn't look away from. No effects, no edits. Yet it went viral, as if everyone had been waiting to hear exactly that. The hashtag Voice of Our Mothers, the Voice of Our Mothers, trended worldwide within 24 hours. Thousands of comments poured in, from those who had endured segregated schooling, from Eleanor's former students, to journalists, lawyers, and people who had never set foot in Ridgepoint. I was told to stay silent or be expelled. Now, I understand it wasn't submission, it was sacrifice. My mother is gone, but if she were alive, I know she would say exactly the same. Media outlets, once divided in their coverage of Brian, began to shift tone. Mocking articles disappeared from front pages. Some stations invited Eleanor for interviews and even proposed a live dialogue between her and city council representatives. She declined. Once, she appeared on camera to say, "I am not here for fame. I'm here to tell today's children, adults are finally speaking up for you." Then she closed her door, no further comment. The impact was faster than Brian expected. Within 3 days, more than a dozen of Eleanor's former students wrote letters to the FBI recounting injustices they'd witnessed. From blocked job opportunities and rigged juries to being forced to withdraw complaints against police. Local activists seized the momentum to push for transparency bills on disciplinary records. Teachers of color organized a symposium titled Teaching in Darkness, Speaking in Light. Brian learned of this not from the press but from Melissa, his close colleague, who sent him the video with a message. "You need to see this, not to fight, but to remember why you started." Alone in his office, he watched every second. There was his mother's voice, steady, uninterrupted, needing no agreement. It was nothing like the hearings he'd led, no charts, no printed evidence, just an undeniable truth. Generations had been silenced for too long. When the clip ended, he did not leap to his feet or make any calls. He opened his notebook, turned to the first blank page, and wrote one line: "When a mother speaks, no one may remain silent." The special hearing room was located on the 3rd floor of the Eastern District Federal Court. Outside, dozens of reporters, camera crews, and security personnel conducted stringent checks. Inside, the seats had been fully occupied early. The hearing was not fully public, but allowed major media to attend within limits. Garrett entered through the side entrance, dressed in an elegant gray suit and charcoal tie. He no longer wore the calm demeanor he had shown in previous media appearances. Following him were 3 lawyers, one specializing in federal criminal law, one in crisis communication, and one who had represented politicians in ethical scandal cases. On the opposite side, the Department of Justice investigative team, led by Judge Rosa Young, was seated, and in the witness area sat Jack Crowell, making his first public appearance since being stripped of his badge. Crowley sat upright, hair neatly trimmed, gaze unwavering. When invited to speak, his voice was slightly hoarse but resolute. "I am Lieutenant Jack Crowley. Served at the Ridgepoint Police Department for 12 years. I am here to speak about what I have done and who ordered me to do it." The entire room fell silent. Crowley did not beat around the bush. He recounted how Garrett assigned tasks to handle sensitive cases, forcing witnesses to sign blank statements, instructing changes in internal report testimonies, and selecting compliant investigators to manage cases involving police violence. "I do not see myself as a victim, but in a system where every exit is locked by the same person, I had no choice." The Department of Justice lawyers did not interrupt. They allowed Crowley to speak fully. After his testimony ended, technicians presented a series of evidence extracted from Garrett's hard drive, a collection of encrypted documents related to internal data manipulation, along with recordings of secret meetings where Garrett gave direct orders. FBI data experts, assigned by Brian Hayes, presented timing analyses, correlating unusual changes in files with meetings between Garrett and his close officer group. A large timeline was projected. The edited reports matched exactly with private meetings between Garrett and key officers. Included was a 2021 case involving the death of an unarmed black youth, originally concluded as a control accident. but later altered to self-inflicted injury. A financial expert presented a series of transactions from internal funds transferred into shell company accounts with indirect shares owned by someone with the initials CW, matching Garrett's family records. Each presentation was concise and factual, providing only data, timing, and attached documents. The atmosphere shifted. Some hearing board members who had previously silently flipped through papers now began taking notes. Some whispered to their assistants. Some frowned when viewing charts overlaying money flows on personnel transfer maps. That silent shift was more significant than any declaration. Garrett sat opposite, maintaining a cold expression, but his jaw began twitching repeatedly, an uncontrollable habit when under pressure. By the session's end, when Crowley was asked to leave the witness stand, the room remained silent. No applause, no words, but clearly a part of the truth had escaped the stone wall the system had tried to hold firm. The hearing resumed in the afternoon with a completely different atmosphere. If the morning had been a moment of data, confessions, and silent shock, the afternoon was when Garrett's lawyers unleashed their main weapon, media counterattack and the race card. The first to stand was Jordan Wexler, a veteran lawyer who had advised over 10 politicians embroiled in scandals. He did not start by disputing data or questioning evidence, but focused on motive. We are hearing testimony from a police officer, Jack Crowley, who beat a citizen in broad daylight. He only started speaking after being stripped of his badge. How do you know this isn't a trade of words for forgiveness? No one interrupted Wexler. He continued, slowly and deliberately, as if each word was calculated. I do not deny flaws in the system, but what I want to ask is, why is this investigation led by someone with a personal relationship to the person forced to kneel? Does anyone here truly believe Brian Hayes, the regional FBI director, can remain objective when his own mother publicly stated that her son carries a generation forced to bow their heads? That is not the words of a public servant. That is the words of an activist. The hearing council stirred slightly. Some reporters took notes faster. Others looked up, waiting for a reaction. But Wexler was not done. He raised a printed dossier, a copy of an article from a far-right political blog with the headline, "Purge Campaign, when the government uses race to cleanse the white police force." He did not read the content, just lightly dropped it on the council table. I do not claim it is true, but I want to ask you, where are we heading if reform means blackening an entire force for a few names? The prosecution objected. The chair allowed continuation but requested avoiding unlawful inferences. The second lawyer stood, a blonde woman with a sharp tone, and began gently reminding about media bias. She pointed out that nearly 60% of articles after Eleanor Hayes' speech came from left-leaning newspapers. A short video clip was played. Eleanor's speech edited to only the phrase, "He carries a generation that was forced to bow their heads." The lawyer paused, piercing the council with her gaze. So who is really leading this hearing? Truth or collective emotion? Temporarily, skepticism began creeping in. On social media platforms, comments split into two streams. Some argued Garrett was using the victim reversal tactic, while others started questioning Brian's actual role throughout the investigation. However, just as media began to falter, a minor incident flipped the scenario. An internal email from Garrett's legal team was leaked, origin unknown. In it, a senior legal associate wrote, "We need to shift focus from data and steer public opinion toward racial emotions, using the mother's speech to expose bias. The public will be confused by racial elements. Avoid letting Garrett speak too much." The brief email, once posted on a legal forum, went viral within hours. That night, Brian did not appear on TV or comment. He sat in a dark office, monitoring every message, every headline. When he saw the leaked email, he closed his laptop, said nothing. But in his eyes, the tension was gone, replaced by certainty. Tomorrow, the final witness will appear, and this time, No one could guess who it would be. 3 days after the hearing, public opinion had yet to calm. The media remained divided, with social media comments focusing deeply on racial issues. The more articles emphasized the bias of the investigation, the more others countered with data, clips, and testimonies. The Ridgepoint City Council made no official statements, but internal signs of instability began to emerge. An anonymous council member revealed in an off-record interview, "If this investigation continues, many old faces will lose their positions in the next term." In this context, a 7-minute video suddenly appeared on platform X, formerly Twitter, from Senator Daniel Kwan's personal account. No prior notice, no hashtags, but its content shifted everything within hours. Senator Kwan, of Korean descent, representing New York, is a prominent independent voice on judicial reform bills, and a victim of discrimination after 9/11. In the video, he sat behind a desk, without banners or star-god background, speaking evenly and firmly. "I'm not speaking because Brian Hayes is black. I'm speaking because he is confronting a disease America has carried in its blood too long: absolute immunity in law enforcement." He did not mention Garrett or attack the city council. Instead, he recounted an incident in 2003 when he himself, then a district attorney, was detained by police, mistaken for a suspicious Asian man. The case was buried, no apologies given, but he remembered. "They looked at me as someone who shouldn't be in that neighborhood, like they looked at Brian, but this time he is not silent." Within 3 minutes of posting, the video reached 200,000 views. By day's end, that number rose to 4 million. National TV stations replayed the full statement. Newspapers, once neutral, began publishing headlines such as, "A voice from Congress, when the previously silenced speak for the silenced now." The Asian American community started sharing the video with the hashtag Justice Needs All Voices. A black veterans organization issued a statement supporting Brian's investigation. The Young Lawyers Association, previously silent, published an article titled, "No One is an Outsider in the Fight for Justice." Brian received the news via email, along with the video link. He did not open it immediately. Only when Melissa, his colleague, entered his office, placed her phone in front of him, and said, "You need to see this with your own eyes," did he sit down quietly. On the screen, Senator Kwan's face remained calm, but his words struck at the heart of the battle. If Brian Hayes fails, it's not just one black man who falls. It's the entire reform system that stops. Within less than 24 hours after Senator Kwan's speech, the atmosphere in Ridgepoint changed significantly. National media shifted coverage, portraying the investigation as a potential landmark precedent. Online commentary focused no longer on personal matters. If a black FBI director is still blocked from investigating, what hope do ordinary citizens have? The city council, silent for weeks, was forced to hold an emergency press conference. Outside, hundreds gathered, holding banners. "We stand with truth, not with position." A female council member, trapped in her car by the crowd, was forced to walk into the hall. At the podium, she said nothing about Senator Kwan or Brian, but in her eyes, the entire city saw clearly. There was no turning back. At the same time, Ridgepoint Police Department issued a press release, the first since Garrett's arrest. The interim command admitted serious irregularities exist in recent disciplinary actions and personnel allocations. "We commit to full cooperation with the Department of Justice in the ongoing investigation." Attached was a commitment to establish a temporary internal inspection team and open an anonymous complaint hotline. Notably, a small line at the end ignited media frenzy. "All documents have been handed over to the federal investigation team proposed by Director Brian Hayes." Brian read the statement in his office, hand still on the mouse, eyes pausing on the words, "proposed." Not coordinated, not directed, but a neutral term, enough to soothe the media, yet emphasizing who was leading. He knew he was still at the system's edge, but at least now the system could no longer turn its back completely. That evening, he appeared in an online panel hosted by the Young Lawyers Association. No live broadcast, no question limits. When asked about his role, Brian did not evade. "I'm not here to claim I'm right. I'm here because I know someone was wrong, and we can't keep pretending otherwise." An attendee asked, "Do you think you'll be transferred after this?" Brian smiled lightly. "I think, if I do right, what happens to me no longer matters much." When the panel ended, an email from Senator Kwan's office arrived with an official invitation to attend a special federal judicial reform hearing involving representatives from 6 states and 3 key senators. Brian replied with only 4 words, "I will attend." He stood up, adjusted his collar. The battle was not over, but from now on, he no longer fought alone. The arrest of Garrett and Crowley's confession shook the nation. In less than 3 days, hundreds of articles, commentary programs, and analytical videos flooded every platform. But instead of creating consensus, the media immediately split into 2 opposing camps. One side hailed Brian as a contemporary hero. Headlines like "The Man Who Dared to Challenge the System" and "Brian Hayes, the Voice of Conscience" flooded newspapers. Constitutional law experts called him a turning point in judicial reform. Former judges, university professors, and human rights activists publicly voiced their support. On the other side, a no less fierce undercurrent arose. Some major TV channels began questioning, why did everything happen so perfectly timed? Why would an officer like Crowley suddenly confess? Could this be a scripted event prepared in advance to topple an entire system? Brian quickly became the central figure in conspiracy theories, a pawn of the deep state, a crisis creator climbing the ladder, a more venomous Obama version. It did not stop there. Some tabloids started digging into Brian's private life. One article, citing anonymous sources, claimed he once had ties to an extremist political activist. Another published a photo of his childhood home, suggesting Brian grew up in a psychologically unstable environment. Talk show segments debated his past, even his demeanor during speeches. Social media became the fiercest battleground. The hashtag #StandWithBrian quickly spread alongside countless clips, memes, and quotes. But just hours later, another hashtag emerged, Brian the Tool. Edited videos, manipulated statements, and fake contexts circulated, some clips even falsely attributing remarks to Brian that he never made. Pressure weighed heavily on his family. A distant cousin was ambushed by reporters at her home, forced into an interview. A retired former colleague appeared on television, vaguely stating, "Brian always intended to go far by causing disruption." An old post from 10 years ago resurfaced simply because he had criticized police handling of protesters. His office at the committee headquarters received hundreds of emails daily, half supportive, half death threats. On the evening news, the host asked, "Hero or manipulator?" That question, instead of seeking truth, became a hook for endless debate. Through it all, Brian chose silence. No appearances, no responses, no press releases. The media called it avoidance strategy, but for Brian it was not strategy. It was a choice, silence, not to run away, but to avoid being drawn into a game he never wanted to play. Media pressure did not ease after a week of silence. On the contrary, that silence deepened public division. Supporters worried, opponents saw it as a sign Brian was starting to falter. Some conservative lawmakers seized the moment to demand a public hearing. Social media turned him into a symbol, or a scapegoat. Under this pressure, the Reform Committee office was forced to hold an official press conference. The venue was a small meeting room on the 3rd floor of the Department of Justice headquarters. Seating was insufficient. Reporters crowded both sides of the aisle. Cameras, microphones, phones, all pointed to a single spot, the wooden podium where Brian would appear. When the door opened, all noise stopped. Brian entered without looking at anyone, holding a piece of paper folded into quarters. He placed it on the podium, unfolded it, glanced through, then looked up. "I won't speak long," he began, his voice low and calm. "I know many have spoken for me, even those who have never met me." He paused. Everyone waited. "I do not seek revenge," he said. "I seek to restore the truth." His first words rang clearly. Some took notes, some captured live stream screenshots. But Brian did not stop. If that makes anyone uncomfortable, the problem is not me. The problem is their conscience. The third and final sentence ended the press conference. No one expected him to stop there. A reporter stood up. "Mr. Hayes, could you elaborate on—" But Brian had already left the podium. He did not look back. The spokesperson behind took the microphone. "We will not take any more questions." The reaction to the press conference spread like shockwaves. Some major channels cut and replayed the three answers repeatedly on screen with the caption, "Silence as a punch." Supporters called Brian a symbol of clarity amid the media storm. Independent political commentators described him as the only one who knows when not to say more. Conversely, opponents reacted fiercely. "Only 3 sentences? That's arrogance, not humility." A far-right paper ran the headline, "Brian Hayes, the man who thinks he's above the system." But Brian did not respond. For the next 2 weeks, he did not appear on television. No interviews. No posts on any platform. All statements were released through his office's press releases. A close assistant was asked by the press why Mr. Hayes did not respond to the new accusations. The assistant replied simply, "He does not react to noise. He acts on truth." On a weekend news program, a commentator asked, "Do you think those 3 sentences were enough to soothe the public?" His guest, a former human rights lawyer, smiled softly. "If the public needs someone to talk a lot to believe, then perhaps we never wanted justice. We only wanted good lines." And Brian? In a random photo, he was seen walking down the committee headquarters hallway, holding files, eyes downcast, unaware or indifferent that the whole country was analyzing every comma in his 3 sentences. The courtroom was jam-packed. Rows of seats were filled with lawyers, journalists, family members of past victims, and those never even mentioned in internal reports. Flash bulbs flickered from the press gallery, all eyes fixed on the central bench, where the judge was leafing through the files before him. The air felt dense. No one dared so much as shift in their seat. Brian Hayes sat at the end of the left row, wearing a dark gray suit with no button fastened. He neither glanced at Garrett nor at Crowley. His gaze rested instead on the elderly woman opposite him, clutching a photo of the young black teenager who had gone missing 6 years ago. Her expression held no anger, only expectation. The judge rapped the gavel, and the room fell silent, as though holding its breath. Rising to his feet, the judge spoke clearly. "Based on the evidence presented, the credible testimony of witnesses, and the grave violation of civil rights by the city's police command," he paused for a moment, then declared, "Defendant Edward Garrett is hereby sentenced to 18 years imprisonment with no possibility of pardon for the first 12 years. A low murmur like an undercurrent swept through the courtroom. He continued, locking eyes on Crowley, who remained bowed. "Defendant Jack Crowley, as an enforcement officer who committed racially motivated violence." The judge's gaze pierced Crowley, is stripped of his badge permanently and barred from any public service. He is also sentenced to 2 years of community service and 5 years of supervised probation. Mitigating factors: full cooperation with investigators and provision of key evidence exposing organized misconduct within the department. A man behind Brian exhaled with relief. A few in front dabbed at tears. Garrett showed no reaction until 2 federal agents approached to handcuff him. His hand trembled violently, the only sign of vulnerability as the cold steel cuffs snapped shut. He looked toward the public gallery, seeking a sympathetic glance, but found none, only dozens of eyes peering through him, as if he were merely the tip of an iceberg yet to melt. Crowley stepped down from the stand in silence, offering no plea for mercy. Passing Brian, he whispered just loud enough, "I have nothing left to say. No remorse, no blame, just an acceptance of fate." Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had waited all morning erupted. As the verdict was announced over loudspeakers, applause mingled with shouts of "Justice for all" and "No more silence." A few raised banners reading, "Not just one trial, but an entire system must be held accountable." Reporters swarmed lawyers for comments, but Brian stood apart, silent, his eyes still on the old woman clutching the missing boy's photo. That boy had never been found. His name never appeared in any report, and no one had been held responsible. Until now. Brian couldn't bring the boy back, but he knew this time she would not leave in despair. Barely an hour later, a short clip showing Garrett in handcuffs being led from the courtroom went viral across social media. The camera shook slightly, but the gavel's final blow and the crowd's cry of "Justice" were crystal clear. The hashtag #JusticeBeyondGarrett trended instantly. On an anonymous former officer forum, a pinned post warned, "If Garrett falls, those who backed him are next. Don't assume hidden cameras won't catch you." Simultaneously, at the Old City Police headquarters, a new complaint arrived. Scanned internal files detailing orders to redirect 7 racially charged cases, 4 of which were never officially opened. The originals bore no signatures, but the level of detail left no room for doubt. The media shifted focus from Crowley and Garrett to larger questions. Who let this go on for over a decade? How many knew and stayed silent? And finally, is this the end or only the beginning? Back at his office, Brian read the latest reports. Within 48 hours of the verdict, 12 new complaints had been filed, one from a former officer, another from an archival clerk, a citizen wrongfully detained. All involved cases covered up during Garrett's reign. His secretary entered, holding a slim file. "Someone sent this for you." The cover bore only a handwritten note. "I sat to his left in 3 briefings. I cannot stay silent any longer." Inside were scanned transcripts of 3 internal recordings, annotated reports, and a still from the hallway camera the night a black detainee was wrongfully held. Absent from any official record, Brian closed the folder, leaned back, and stared out the window. Outside, the sky was gray. That evening, the national news began a special report. Garrett is just the surface. What lies beneath the iceberg? Guests included a human rights lawyer, a former federal inspector, and the boy who filmed the park incident. Young but composed, he told the camera, "I recorded it because it felt wrong, but after seeing everything, I think adult should have acted. Before I pulled out my phone." Public outrage only intensified, like a wave crashing ashore. Several black members of Congress proposed forming a National Independent Police Oversight Commission. On the Justice Department's desk lay 3 draft reform bills, and one name highlighted for commission chair, Brian Hayes. When his secretary asked if he wanted to respond, he said only, "Not yet, not now." That night, Brian walked home alone. No reporters trailing him, no lights in his face, just a city stirring itself awake, questions growing in its people's minds. And in his own, if this system still rots at its core, how many times will I have to start over? The meeting did not take place in a grand conference room. There was no guest list, no note-taking secretary, only 2 people, Brian Hayes and Attorney General Eleanor Sharp. Her office occupied the top floor, quietly overlooking Constitution Avenue. The door closed behind them. The air in the room felt thick. No polite small talk, no long introductions. Brian sat opposite her, arms folded, eyes level. "If you appointed me just to appease public opinion," he said slowly, "choose someone else. I'm not a figurehead for half measures." Sharp said nothing. She poured herself a glass of water and set another before him, but Brian did not touch it. "I agree to chair the commission," he continued, "on clear conditions." She gave a slight nod, inviting him to continue. "First, the commission must have independent investigative authority. It must not report through any administrative unit under investigation. Otherwise, we're just puppets in a political theater. Second, full access to every piece of internal data from local police departments, including internal disciplinary records, closed complaint files, and every use of force report. Third, he paused, meeting her gaze, the commission must not be overseen by any law enforcement agency currently under investigation. If I discover any tampering with documents, I will publish it immediately. Sharp leaned back, silent for a long moment. "You're asking for more than anyone who has ever held this position," she said. "I am not like those who came before me," he replied. A flicker of a smile touched her lips, but her eyes remained steely. "There are things you will not be able to change." "I don't need to change everything," Brian answered. "I only need enough authority to begin peeling back the layers of decay covering this system." Sharp studied him a few more seconds, then reached for a file and signed the last page. "This is your commission order, and the statement of the commission's powers." Brian took it without smiling or saying thank you. He simply nodded and stood. No applause, no press release, no line of aides waiting outside to congratulate him. As he stepped out, only one person awaited him, a former assistant from his FBI days. "Do you really think this will change anything?" she asked. Brian did not answer at once. He looked down to the street below, where the crowd went about their day, unaware of the negotiation that had just taken place. Then he said quietly, "I did not come to save the system. I came to dismantle it and see what's rotten inside." The reintegration program ran quietly at a small community center on the city's outskirts. No banners, no cameras, just a few dozen people seated in plastic chairs arranged in a circle. This was a space for former officers stripped of their badges, a transition to help them rejoin civilian life, volunteer their time, and, at least in theory, confront themselves. Crowley had been attending for 3 weeks. He volunteered unpaid at the homeless shelter's dining hall, swept the floors, picked up trash, and sat reading in the library when there was nothing else to do. Those who once knew the arrogant officer no longer recognized the man before them. Shorn hair, hunched shoulders, eyes cast low. Brian wasn't on the guest list, yet he arrived uninvited. "I want to see the end for myself," he told the organizer as he walked in. No one stopped him or asked questions. As Brian entered, the room went still. Conversations halted, eyes shifted away, and a few heads quietly turned. Crowley sat at the back of the circle, head bowed, hands clasped on his knees. Brian didn't take a seat. He stood directly in front of Crowley and waited in silence. Crowley rose too. No swagger, no grin, just a straight posture, a nod, and a slight bow. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Crowley said evenly, voice steady. "I don't deserve it, but I need to say this." Brian said nothing. "When the clip went viral," Crowley continued, "I hid in my house for 3 days. Not because I feared the press, but because, for the first time, I saw myself from an undeniable perspective." He paused and inhaled deeply. "I thought I was the system, that I upheld order. Instead, I was just a tool, hollow, cold, and blind." No one interrupted or broke the silence. Crowley's words offered no excuses, no tears, just heavy stones dropped one by one. Brian's gaze never wavered. After a moment, he spoke softly, "I forgive you." Crowley looked up, momentarily unsteady, but Brian wasn't finished. "Yet I cannot forgive your silence back then, when you knew Garrick coerced confessions, when you knew innocent people were entrapped. You weren't in handcuffs. You weren't gagged. You simply chose not to speak." Crowley nodded without protest. Brian turned and walked out, passing the silent circle and leaving behind an atmosphere weighted not with hatred, but with truth, and the knowledge that no apology, however heartfelt, could wash it away. The next morning, at 7:30 a.m., Brian arrived at the National Executive Reform Commission headquarters. No one called him, and no official schedule awaited. He couldn't delay after yesterday. He passed the lobby, where people moved as though nothing had happened. He entered the conference room, its walls plastered with charts. Excessive force rates, suppressed internal complaints, neighborhoods with the highest civilian grievances. A stack of unreviewed files lay on the table, each a story once ignored. Brian ignored them. He sat, opened his laptop, and then closed it. Instead, he retrieved a crumpled manila envelope from his drawer. Inside was the letter he'd written to Crowley days earlier but never sent. No accusations, no threats, just a closing line. "If you truly wish to atone, teach your child never to brand someone dangerous simply because of their skin color." He reread it once, then tore it up. Not because he forgave, but because a reminder like that didn't need to come from him. Crowley would remember, or not. But the burden no longer rested on Brian. A soft knock sounded. His assistant entered with the membership list for the commission's first meeting. A few familiar names, several colleagues who'd once avoided him in the halls, and a handful who'd publicly criticized him as overreacting. Today, they would all sit at the same table. Brian straightened his shirt, stood, and stepped into the room. Heads turned, not in deference, but neither did they interrupt when he began to speak. Reform isn't about new uniforms or fresh slogans to pretend nothing ever happened, he said, voice low and firm. Reform means staring into the system's rottenness and refusing to look away, even when it's what fed us. He paused, scanning each face. I don't need you to like me. I only need you not to blind yourselves to the truth. No one replied or walked out. After the meeting, a young officer approached and extended his hand. Thank you for not giving up, he said. Brian shook it without a word. For the first time in months, he felt a small lightness, not from victory, but because he refused to let others' silence make him silent too. The federal Capitol building was brilliantly illuminated, casting long shadows that stretched across its grand facade. Inside, the main hallway leading to the expansive meeting room was bustling with activity. It was filled with a sea of people dressed in formal attire. The press section was cordoned off, with rows of cameras meticulously arranged as if awaiting the arrival of a historic moment. In the main hall, every delegate seat was fully occupied by figures from various states, each embodying authority and influence. On the second floor, rows of seats for the public were packed with attentive citizens, their faces focused and tense. The atmosphere was heavy. No loud conversations, no laughter, no distracting phone sounds. A reverent hush had fallen over the gathering. Behind the sturdy wooden doors, Brian Hayes stood alone, his grip tightened around a speech folded meticulously into thirds. The document was dense with words, yet every line was intentional, not a single phrase was wasted. This speech was his own creation, forged from the raw steel of personal experience and profound humiliation. It contained no editorial interference, no media spin, no consultant's advice, only the truth, distilled from decades of service and suffering. The truths those before him in the hall had long avoided confronting. Today, Brian was about to speak, not only about the plans for reforming a broken system. More importantly, he would bear witness to the nation and declare a reality long suppressed, that this system did not accidentally produce injustice, but rather actively cultivated and protected it for 30 long years. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. In his mind's eye, the film of his career played out in vivid detail. The grueling days in the field, sleepless nights poring over files, desperate moments trying to convince reluctant witnesses. Then, like a sharp blow to his chest, the image emerged once more. The moment Crowley had kicked him down, forcing him to kneel in the park. Not because Brian defied the law, but because he simply did not belong in that place. What wounded him far more than the kick was the crowd's gaze, eyes that saw but chose not to act. In that moment, a question rose in Brian's heart. Does justice truly come from the system, or from those brave enough to break it? Outside the hall, a massive screen broadcasted the scene live. At the West Community Center in the city, Crowley sat among a small group of homeless people, his gaze fixed blankly on the screen. His lips were still, his expression unreadable, silent. At the farthest row in the Capitol meeting room, an elderly woman clutched a photograph of her son tightly against her chest. Her son had been a final-year student who died following an unrecorded interrogation, his case quietly closed due to insufficient evidence. On the upper right balcony, a young man wearing a white shirt with a loosened tie sat in a reserved seat. He was the boy who had once filmed Crowley forcing Brian to kneel. Now grown, his hair neatly cut, his eyes remained the same, clear, determined, unwavering. Mr. Brian Hayes, appointed to lead the Federal Police Reform Committee, will speak. The chair's voice echoed crisply over the microphone, resonating against the stone walls of the vast hall. There was no applause, no whispered murmur, not even a cough. The room held its breath. Brian opened his eyes. He folded the speech once again and stepped confidently to the podium. No FBI badge adorned his chest. No logos framed his presence. There was only him, a man standing not for a title but for a truth that demanded to be heard. The spotlight bathed the podium in brilliant white light. Brian paused silently for several seconds, his gaze sweeping across hundreds of faces. Legislators, military generals, senior government officials, all watching intently. Yet no one was truly ready to listen. Some anticipated a politically safe speech. Others hoped for failure, and some had come simply because protocol required their attendance. But Brian knew exactly why he was there. "I will not begin with statistics," he said, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the silence. "Nor will I start with titles or positions, because I do not stand here today as the Director of Criminal Investigations, and I do not speak to ease the conscience of this system." The hall seemed to freeze. A few delegates sat straighter. Brian's eyes met the chairs before drifting toward the woman clutching the photograph, frozen in grief. "I was once forced to kneel," he continued steadily, "not because I broke any law, not because I threatened public safety, but because I was deemed out of place in the very area I was serving." A ripple of whispers spread through the press section, but Brian pressed on without hesitation. "I once believed that by doing right, upholding the law, dedicating myself fully, possessing credentials and rank, this system would protect me. I was wrong. It did not protect me. It remained silent, as it has remained silent for thousands who have knelt, pleaded, and disappeared without a single frame of footage." He paused, raising the speech paper as if to read, but then setting it down unused. "Today, I do not represent the FBI. I stand for those who have knelt unseen, those without cameras, without badges, without microphones. Yet they existed, and the system was silent." He stepped forward, resting both hands lightly on the podium's edge, his voice unwavering. "If you wish for me to lead this reform committee, understand this: I will not seek compromises. I will seek the truth, and that truth will be uncomfortable. It will disturb many. It will unsettle the quiet peace enjoyed by those who have sat complacently for far too long." Faces of legislators stiffened. Some narrowed their eyes, skeptical or defensive, yet no one interrupted. "If tomorrow I am removed from this position, I will persist," Brian declared firmly, "because I did not begin this journey with power. I began it with injustice, and I will not cease while justice lies buried beneath the surface." He stepped back from the podium, refusing to bow or await applause, because he knew there would be none. The entire hall remained enveloped in silence. But this silence was no longer indifference. It was the silence of confrontation. No denial, no retreat, no feigned ignorance. Brian exited the stage. Outside in the public square, the giant screen still displayed his face, not as a government official, but as a man who had been trampled upon, yet still stood tall, unwavering, and resolute. The story of Brian Hayes is not merely the struggle of a black man against a fractured police system. It reflects a reality many face daily: prejudice, silence, and the pain of being undervalued simply because of skin color, past, or outward details that do not reveal a person's true worth. The first lesson is, do not judge others hastily by appearances. In the moment Brian was forced to kneel, humiliated and kicked by a police officer in the park, he did not threaten or wield power, though he could have. He rose with proud silence, revealing his FBI badge, letting the truth speak for itself. He did not have to shout, "Who I am." He made them realize their prejudice was the grave mistake. We live in a fast-paced world where judgments form in seconds. A glance, a piece of clothing, a skin tone, all can lead to misunderstanding, insult, or even violence. But Brian's story reminds us there are skilled, courageous, compassionate people mistreated simply because they do not fit society's familiar image of power or value. The second lesson is, talent and human worth cannot be underestimated due to background, skin color, or temporary status. Brian was not only a capable leader, he once trusted others' ability to change, and gave someone like Crowley a chance. Yet Crowley's betrayal taught Brian that the system must not be built on blind trust but upheld by responsibility and transparency. Many are underestimated, overlooked because others don't truly know them. Some quietly prove themselves through results and actions, and some, like Brian, choose to speak out, so the system must not offer only formal apologies but take real accountability. The third lesson is, justice does not come by itself. It must be claimed. When Brian showed his badge to the crowd, it was not to assert power, but to show even the head of an investigative agency can be crushed if the system loses its moral foundation. He did not stop at self-protection. He opened investigations, exposed networks of manipulation, demanding full transparency. In a healthy society, justice cannot come from silence or the random kindness of those in power. It must be led by those who dare to face the truth, even if that means isolation, opposition, or overturning a rotten system. The final and most important lesson: true strength does not come from titles, but from daring to stand on the right side, even alone. Brian did not need a large team or fanfare. He had evidence, resolve, and an unshakable principle. If injustice is done to anyone, no matter how big the system is, it must be scrutinized. Have you ever been misjudged because someone did not understand you? Ever been looked at with suspicion because you didn't fit the majority? Or quietly proven your worth beyond others' assumptions, yet no one saw your efforts? Brian Hayes' story is a powerful reminder. We must not remain silent. Every time we stay silent in the face of injustice, we let it continue. And then those we love and those we believe in become the next victims. If you have been hurt by prejudice, share your story. If you have witnessed injustice but couldn't speak, learn to stand up, starting today. And if this story makes you think about society, justice, and change, share it. Let more people know. Change is possible, but it requires courage. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. We don't just tell stories, we spark action, because sometimes a timely can save an entire system from going astray. Thank you for taking the time to follow my channel. Your support and interest are powerful motivations that drive me to continue producing meaningful, high-quality content. In the days ahead, I'll bring you even more compelling stories and sharper perspectives, not just to entertain, but to speak to truths that deserve to be heard. Please, keep watching, sharing, and spreading the message, because this journey always has room for those who believe in truth and human worth. Thank you so much.